have a very interesting subject this morning, and one that probably is not often discussed these days, and that is the story of Aesop the slave. Very little is known about him historically. There are few references in Herodotus. For the most part, he is an apocryphal figure. He's a mysterious, uncertain, dimly perceived personality who probably lived about 550 B.C. The meager descriptions that we have tell us that he was a slave, that he was deformed, he was a hunchback, and he was born dumb without the power of speech. But through the intercession of a goddess, probably Athena, his speech was given to him, and he went about telling fables, telling short, moralistic stories, pointing out the integrities and lack of integrities of his contemporaries. Because of his unusual wittiness and brilliance, he was freed by his master, but because of the sharp bobs in his stories and the rather sadistic attitude he took towards the dominant policies of his time, he was finally framed on a charge of robbery and executed. This is all that we actually know about him. Now, the fable, as it stands by itself, apart from him, is usually a very short story with a very definite moral purpose. Fables are of many kinds. They are symbols, they are emblems, they are various devices of words to reveal unusual or significant meanings. From the collections of ancient fables that we have, it would appear that they taught essentially the same moral and ethical principles that we hold today. In other words, the ancient fable is a definite link in the descent of the integrities which we cherish now. But the fables point out that 2,500 years ago, they had the same integrities and also abused them. The same corruptions must have been present because the fables point these things out. And they are of a kind and nature that helps us perhaps to understand the great span of human effort for the last 3,000 years. The origin of these fables is uncertain. A few probably can be attributed directly to Aesop, who gained a reputation for them. But the collections that have since been formed under his name did not all originate with him. There probably are not more than 50 of the fables that can definitely be traced to Aesop. Of the rest, more than 500 belong to various collections and classifications, interpretations and interpolations that assemble themselves later. One of the most interesting aspects of the fable is to try to find out in what part of the world it began. About the same time that Aesop was telling his stories and pointing out his little moral lessons to the Grecians, Gautama Buddha was using precisely the same methodology in his so-called Jataka tales. These Jatakas are really stories, presumably, of the previous incarnations of Buddha. and they go all the way back to his embodiment in various animal forms and the experiences that happen to him in these forms. There are the same moralisms, the same basic statements of integrities, and they were compiled at approximately the same time. We have not much understanding of contact between Asia and the Greek states at the time of Buddha. We know that the travelers from eastern countries, merchants particularly, did carry various goods along the caravan routes and were finally able to dispense with these goods at Ephesus, Antioch, and Alexandria. Therefore, there is no doubt that a certain amount of literature, a certain amount of legend and story followed the caravan routes and became accessible to the European and Near Eastern people. In any event, the two patterns are almost identical, and some of the actual fables are on exactly the same themes. So that somewhere in the past there was a contact between the East and West on the level of moral stories. Now, the fable is a very brief story, nearly always, seldom exceeding 100 or 200 words, sometimes not more than 50 words. But it tells a happening. It sets up a story of some kind. Now, the problem of the fables of Aesop have been somewhat complicated by the fact that most of his fables involve animals. The various fables that we have from him, and many others, including the recension of his fables by Fontaine later, these all humanize the intellects of other creatures that are not human. They make these creatures think as we do. They place them in situations that are uniquely human, and they bestow upon the animal the same essential integrities and vitalities that we associate with human beings. This has in turn led to considerable expansion of language and to the development of many ideas and concepts that have come down to us in nursery rhymes and Mother Goose stories, such as, for instance, The Dog in the Manger, and others of a similar nature. These fables began to appear in print almost immediately after the discovery of printing in Europe in 1450. And from that time on to the present day, every change, every development, every curiosity of printing can be traced directly from editions of Aesop's fables. All the famous printers made copies or published issues of these fables. And from the earliest printings, which were in the 1480s, to the present time, there's probably never been a year in which some version of Aesop's fables has not been in print. We wonder sometimes why these have had such a tremendous tenacity. We wonder why great artists like Dürer and Gustave Doré illustrated the fables. We also know that many of the early woodcut artists did beautiful descriptive pictures of these legends and fables. Every type of illustration, from the poorest caricature to masterpieces of painting, have been dedicated to this theme. About 1840 or 50, an edition of some of Aesop's fables appeared in China, and the Chinese translation became immediately popular. It became so popular that finally it came to the attention of some of the officials who decided that Aesop was downgrading the mandarins, that he was picking on the rights of royalty to rule and all this type of thing, and they banned the fables. It is very likely that the opinion of the Chinese in the 19th century is the very point of view that resulted in the execution of Aesop in the 6th century BC. So we have all kinds of associations involving these peculiar fables and legends. Now, the problem that we probably always face with this type of literature is to try to trace its development. We know that from the beginning it was very simple. We know that it borrowed very heavily from Oriental sources and North African sources, that it was supplemented and intensified and further amplified even as late as the period of Charlemagne in Europe. Some feel that the stories were brought to Europe by the Crusaders, who found them in the Near East. More theorizing on this subject is perhaps available than almost any other example of literary problem. I think, though, we must gradually come to the realization with these fables that some peculiar circumstance brought them all together, and also gave a very much more sprightly insight into the nature of Aesop. This comparatively forgotten figure, who probably never was a very famous man, even in his highest moments, this figure was embellished, enriched, and to Aesop was attributed much of the moral literature of the civilized world. He gained great importance, and the number of his fables was strongly increased during the Alexandrian period in Egypt. Now, Alexandria was a tremendous center of literary creativity. We know that the Alexandrian people were responsible for the rise of a large number of apocryphal things. They were responsible for the appearance of sacred books that were not found in the original biblical canon. They were interested in the Gnostics. They gained a supremacy in the Kabbalah and all kinds of metaphysical beliefs. Neoplatonism, Neopythagoreanism flourished there. Alchemy founded a great center for the promulgation of its concepts. And here, in the midst of all this, comes a sudden amplification of Aesop. It would seem probable that actually the Aesop's fable structure that we know now, not the separate fables, but the assembly of them and the increase of their number, both of these were due to the Alexandrian factor. A whole group of scholars in Alexandria about the time of the Emperor Augustus were hard at work backdating more recent writings. These scholars would take something that was developed in Alexandria and attribute it to someone who had been dead for 500 years. This seemingly not only increased the merit of the production in the public mind, but lifted from the contemporary authors the responsibility. In other words, if you could say that you were only reprinting something that had been written much earlier, there was less likelihood of you being accused of treason or something of that nature. So that the Alexandrian nexus was certainly important in the development of Aesop. And the morality of the Aesop fables show definitely the influence of the Gnostics, the Neoplatonists, early Christian mysticism, and the early Jewish philosophies. It's a very unusual situation, one that practically demands some type of investigation, or at least a realization that you're dealing with a traditional classical composition. Another possibility involving the Alexandrian situation is, as we know, the Alexandrian libraries were destroyed. They were accidentally burned by Caesar and were intentionally destroyed finally by the caliphs of Baghdad. In the interval of the destructions of these various libraries, there perished, it is believed, nearly 1 million ancient records. These included books that we have heard of by name only in the writings of various authors, but the original books were destroyed. One group of literature after another faded away. Ancient tablets, historical records, scientific knowledge, all went up in flames together in the Brachyon and the Serapeum in Alexandria. Now, it's always possible that many of the ideas and even documents that we now believe were fabricated by the Alexandrians may have actually existed. Copies were made of them, and the originals were lost in the destructions of the libraries. So it is not fair to say with certainty that all the backdating was false. Some of it may have been based upon lost originals that were destroyed by the vandalism of unhappy and unfortunate human beings. In any event, the fables come down to us. Now let us consider the fables themselves a little bit in the same spirit that we might consider the fables of the various Arabic poets or East Indian philosophers, or even taken as fragments out of the sacred writings of the East or of Persia or the ancient Babylonian Talmud. All of these writings have little stories in them which could be dressed up and become a powerful moralism with a little dramatization and the creation of a small plot to give special meaning to the various exercises or beliefs. So now then we'll take just one of the fables to start with, which I think is a good example. Once upon a time, a group of foxes helped a lion on the hunt. The lion asked them to assist him in capturing a deer for dinner. And the foxes were very agreeable, and they helped him, and the time came when the hunt was successful. And they all gathered around the lion. The lion said, "Now skin the deer and divide it into 4 stacks," there being 3 animals involved beside himself. So it was divided, and the lion, the king of beasts and the mighty one of all, declared that he was the one who was going to divide the food. And he said, the first quarter goes to me, because I am the majesty, I am the ruler of the forest. That's my right. The second quarter goes to me because of the fact that I was the one who was selected to legally arbitrate the distribution. The third quarter also goes to me because of the fact that I was the one who led the chase. And as to the fourth quarter, the lion stopped for a moment. He said, "Let me see anyone take this from me on any grounds." Now the moral is down in the lower line of it, where it says, these little people can help the great people to be rich, but they must not expect to benefit anything from the wealth. They will not get any of it. It will all stay with the big people. Now, we have some complaints like that wandering around here at the present time. And there is an appearance that for 2,600 years we've been doing approximately the same thing. Now, another one of the fables that doesn't deal with animals in this particular case deals with a very old man, tired, who gathered wood in the forest. And his back was bent, and he grew more and more infirm, and he grumbled more and more. And he put these bundles of faggots together, and finally one day he's called out in a loud voice. He said, "Oh, I can't do this any longer. I want death to come and take me." And about that time, death popped up and said, "Here I am." Well, the man said, "I'm awfully glad to see you. Will you help me put these faggots on my back?" The wisdom of these rather subtle stories is so apparent and so cutely contrived that they have become more or less patterns for whole novels. Whole books have been written to amplify the very simple statements that are found in the Aesop fables. There is another one of the fables that I think we are mostly familiar with, and that is the fable of the sour grapes. Everyone, I think, knows that story, of how the fox tried to get the grapes off of the lattice work that was protecting the vines. And he jumped and he cried and he crawled and he did everything to try to reach the grapes, but he couldn't reach them. So finally he turned away and said, well, they were probably sour anyway. From which we have a statement we commonly use: sour grapes. One after another, these stories seem to fit into our needs. There's another one that has a little political implication that is rather cute, and that is the one about the frogs. A whole group of frogs were in a pond, and they were living very happily and pleasantly together, but they seemed to feel the need of some kind of leadership. They wanted something to look up to. So they prayed to Zeus to send them a leader. And Zeus looked the situation over carefully, and he dropped into the pond a large piece of wood, a shapeless piece of an old tree trunk, and said, there's your leader. Well, when he dropped this wood in the pond, the frogs were so frightened by the noise and the disturbance in the water that they did not even dare go near the log for a long time. But finally, they got more and more courageous and more daring and got closer and closer to the log, until at last they found out what it was. And they were very unhappy and disappointed, because they had asked for a leader, and all that was given to them was a log. So they asked Zeus a second time to send them a leader, and he sent them a heron, a bird with very long legs and a long beak, who was particularly fond of frogs. And as a result of this, in a very short time, the heron was eating the frogs. And the survivors, again, besought the help of Zeus to do something about this problem. And Zeus told them they'd have to take care of themselves from that point on. When they had no strong leader, they were happy. When they got a strong leader, he exploited them. And Zeus told the frogs very simply that any time you have a strong leader, you are apt to have someone that will eat up the frogs. In other words, the stronger the leader, the more likely he is to prove to be a dictator or something of that kind and destroy the very people that he is supposed to lead. And the obvious moral of this and other ones of Aesop's fables is that it is better to have a respect for a comparatively unknown leadership, or something that is just there, than it is to get a nice, strong leader who in turn will use the people for his own advantage. So there must have been some place back in Greece or in India or somewhere where this particular circumstance inspired a fable. And these fables are always inspired by some circumstance that occurred. Then, of course, there is the fable of the boy that cried wolf. This is one of the most basic of the old fables. There was a young shepherd, and he had to take his flock out into the meadows, and he was lonesome, and he wanted some company, and he didn't know what to do. So he finally hit upon the idea of crying wolf, and going into town and asking the townspeople to come out and help him protect his flocks. And the townspeople, kindly enough and willingly enough, did it. And he had a wonderful time. He enjoyed himself so much that a few days later he cried wolf again. And they all came out and helped him the second time. And he thought he really had found a solution to being lonesome. In the meantime, a number of actual wolves got around the flock and began to look as though they intended to take away some of the sheep. So the young boy this time, in all seriousness, yelled, "Wolf!" but no one came. And the result was that the animals devoured a large part of his flock. So he wanted to know why they hadn't come this time. And the townspeople, represented by an elder of the group, said, "If you lie often enough, you will not be believed when you tell the truth." And this, the cry of wolf, has simply come down to us as a symbol of this kind of deceit. Another interesting fable is that of the dog and the bone, which Aesop is believed to be one of his original fables. In this case, a dog walking across a little bridge with a bone in his mouth happens to look down into the water and sees a reflection. And the reflection looks like another dog with a bone in its mouth, and he immediately decides that he wants the second bone also, in addition to his own. In order to get the second bone, he opens his mouth and snaps at it, and the real bone in his own mouth falls into the water and is lost forever. So that the moral of it is, when you're not satisfied with what you have, you'll probably lose what you already have trying to get something you do not have. And this, again, could be considered more or less contemporary as far as our problems are concerned. In the course of time, we also find that a varied group of legends have been involved into the fable structure, such as many of the fairy tales and such stories as Cinderella and various folk legends of European peoples. They have gradually been built into moral stories. And one point that is quite obvious is that nearly all your fairy tales have happy endings. In other words, in the end, virtue has to triumph. And it is this triumph of virtue that really becomes one of the main points in the Aesop collection of fables. It must be that the integrities and values of life are preserved regardless of the vicissitudes of living. Another interesting fable tells of the story of a dispute in heaven. In this particular dispute, it is assumed by one party that all living things will be the same, regardless of what kind of bodies they're in. And the other point of view was that if you change the body, you will probably change the personality and the appetites and the conditions. So as to prove this, the gods took a cat, and they transformed it into a beautiful maiden, and arranged this maiden to be married to a human being. And the marriage was a great success, and there was no vestige of the cat in the maiden at all. It looked as though they'd won completely and could collect the wager. But the goddess Venus said, "Wait just a moment." So she created a little mouse and put it in the room. And instantly the beautiful maiden pounced on the mouse. And Venus said, "See, it never changes. Opportunities change, but the old ways still linger." And Aesop uses this fable to explain a great many problems of human life, that no matter what condition we find ourselves in, the essential traits of our characters remain much the same. And the fact that we are rich or poor, handsome or homely, makes very little difference. We will be what we are. And under pressure of circumstances, we will go back to the basic circumstances of our own temperaments and dispositions. And so it goes through a whole group of these very interesting and wonderful stories. There's a story relating to industry that is quite cute. There was a fox who was very thirsty and found a jug of water. But the neck of the jug was small, and he couldn't get his snout into the jug far enough to get the water. And he was really dying of thirst, So it was a very serious emergency. So he pondered and he thought and he wondered, and finally he had an idea. He took little pebbles and one by one dropped them into the urn until the pebbles raised the water level and then he could reach it. Then he had the water that he needed and was very happy there afterward. And the moral of this is that when you are in emergency, there is nearly always a solution if you think it through. Every mystery, every problem can be solved. The only problem is whether you have the ingenuity to solve it. Another one of Aesop's fables, which probably began in Alexandria, is the story of the old man who left nothing to his son but a wooden idol. And this wooden idol was very, very little compensation to the young man. But the father told him, he said, this idol can be of great service to you. Therefore, never neglect it. Always respect it and continue to keep it in your family. So the young man did as he was told, but he was poor. He prayed to the idol, but nothing happened. And finally he said, the idol is phony. It doesn't do anything for me. And he took an axe and he struck the idol with the axe. The wooden image broke and was filled with cold coins inside. This was an instinct or an impulse to always expect to find something valuable inside of anything that has received long and definite veneration. You can apply this to wisdom, to ideas, to notions. You can even deny them. You can say there's nothing to them. But rather, if you explore them, examine them, and find what is in them, nearly everything is useful. Nearly everything has a constructive meaning if you wish to search for the solution to the mystery. So this fable, I think, was Alexandrian because it is not as clearly in the spirit of the original morality of Aesop as some of the other better-known ones. Most of the animals and birds and so forth in the Aesop fable collection are humanized. And I remember old Ernest Thompson Seton, who was probably one of the great naturalists of his time. He told me one day, he said, you know, this has been a trouble with humanity from the beginning. We have always assumed that other creatures are like ourselves, but unable to express what they are like. In other words, we take a lion or a bear or a horse, and we give it a human mind instinctively, even when we work with it. In the family, if we have a cat, we talk to it, just as though it could understand what we say. If we have a horse, we pat it, and we assume that it loves us or cares for us or is interested in us. And we take all kinds of animals and we humanize them in our own approach, giving them our own peculiar abilities and using them as symbols of our own attitudes. Diogenes, a famous 15th and early 16th century physiognomist, used animal faces to indicate human temperaments. He's declared that all human beings, to some degree, are reminiscent in appearance to some non-human creature. The old senator, who was called Eaglebeak, because he had a very prominent nose and a bald head, was assumed to have the same general temperament as the eagle. And in many cases, the physiognomist, even as recently as Lavater, who was probably the greatest of them all, was able to prove that there is a certain reminiscence of appearance to various other creatures to be found in most human compositions. Astrologers say that this is due to the fact that people born under the different signs of the zodiac take on something of the appearance of the sign creature under which they are born. Therefore, the Leo person has a sort of leonine look, and the Virgo person is extremely human and almost completely normal in appearance, one of the few signs in which there is practically no vestige of animal prominence due to the fact that the sign is completely human. Then there are people who are heavy-set, like the Piscean fish, or there are those who have the goat look of the Capricornian, and the Taurians sometimes have the heavy neck of the bull and protruding eyes. These were, according to the ancients, indications that the animal propensities were to be found in human beings, and that in those where these propensities occur, the temperaments or traits of character would also carry over. As a result of that, it was useful in cartooning and caricaturing to represent human beings by various animals, insects, and birds. It seemed to be something that we instinctively do. And in the same way, we bestow upon these creatures our own attitudes and assume that they think as we do, and that they believe as we believe, and that they have peculiar emotional and psychic reactions to us. Now, your American Indians and most primitive people have a certain close psychological sympathy with animals. The American Indians, for instance, the Plains Indians particularly, had to hunt to survive. They had not developed any agrarian propensities. They had no way of providing food except by following the herd of buffalo and things of that nature. But the Indian never killed for sport. He never destroyed any life for fun or merely to demonstrate skill. He had no problem of thinning out of herds because this situation didn't exist. But the Indian also always regarded the animal as, in a strange way, human. He would talk to the animal. He would try to explain why it was necessary for him to kill in order to feed his family and to take care of the responsibilities of his tribal life. But the Indian had an interesting little addenda that he put on nearly all of his hunting activities. He believed that someday human beings would be animals, and animals would be human. And he also therefore said, when he asked the animal not to hold it against him that he had to kill him for food, he said, if later I am an animal and you are human, and you have need of food, I will give my body to you. It was a peculiar attitude, but it was one that represented a very great sincerity of motive. The Indian never believed in destruction. The Indian also, of his own nature, bestowed upon animals certain psychic propensities. He also regarded them as the symbols of his clans and tribes, a heraldry of totemism, in which each animal had its clan among humans. And you see this development in the historical tribal records found in the totem poles of the Northwest. All of these animal totems were beings. They were gods, or nature spirits, guardian principles. And these animals and humans had a fraternity, a kinship, a common community of life and interest. And these animals, according to the legends, talked with human beings in dreams and visions. And there was very little division between the animal kingdom and the human. Now we know today that there is some form of communication between other creatures and man that we do not fully understand. I think I have told you before that Seton told me on one occasion that it seemed to him that to the animals, human beings were gods. That in some mysterious way, the animal worshipped man without knowing what he was, much as we worship deities without knowing what they are. As an example of that, he said that one day when he was out in the plains, a hunter was chasing a deer. And this hunter had his gun, and he was trying to get the deer into position to shoot it. The deer represented the fear of the animal life of man, was terrified, and somehow seemed to know that its life was in danger, even though the hunter had not fired his shot. The deer, to escape the hunter, rushed to Seaton and stood alongside of him, even though Seaton also carried a gun. The animal seemed to know that this man would not hurt him. And animals have on a number of occasions taken refuge with human beings to escape other human beings. Such habits or attitudes are very difficult for us to understand, but Burbank had the same idea with plants, and there is a whole fabulism of plants if you want to study it. According to Burbank, the plant does not have the human sensory perceptions. It does not have 5 senses as man has. But he said in his researches he had discovered that in its own world and in its own life and in its own way, plants had more sensory perceptions than human beings. They are different, but they are there. And he estimated that plants, a fairly developed plant, probably had in the neighborhood of 20 sensory perceptions. These perceptions were useful only within its own world, within its own kind. We know, for example, the experiments made with labyrinths and plants. A labyrinth created, very complicated one, with many false turns and so on, and completely covered. And a vine was placed at the beginning of this labyrinth, and there was no way for it to grow back. The labyrinth was closed behind it. The only way it could reach the light that it needed to survive was to make at least a dozen or 15 turns in strange, blind-ended passageways, of which only one led to the light. And the light might be behind a dozen or more blinds and false turns. And the experiments show that the plant, in every case, without hesitation or without doubt, developed directly through the correct passageways and straight to the light. This indicates something. No one seems to know just what, but it seems to indicate that the plant, and certainly a higher form of life, the animal, has a certain ability to direct and dominate its own career and purposes, so that it can accomplish that which is necessary to its own survival. We find this all through the plant kingdom. We know the palm tree in the desert will drop a taproot 60 feet down through the sand to reach water. All of these things indicate some form of wise and protective government. Now, Gautama Buddha and many of the Orientalists who were much given to the use of fables regarded them more or less as indications of latent potentials within the human being. The human being has powers and faculties which we do not use and mostly do not understand. In Buddhism and Hinduism both, it is assumed that every power of every creature inferior to man exists also within man. That the human being has within himself every potency of knowledge, every skill, every ability, every vital resource that can be represented by any animal, plant, or even the fission of minerals. The human being, therefore, is a tremendously complicated creature. It has all the kingdoms, the mineral, the vegetable, the animal, and its own, within its structure. And in the process of the prenatal epoch, the embryo passes through all of these stages. As a result of that, the Oriental pays great attention to the subtle indications of powers and propensities that are overlooked. The Oriental, Buddhism and Hinduism both, assume that man in his development, in his human development, has emphasized those faculties and powers which were most convenient to his purposes. He was in a material environment. Therefore, he developed all types of external functions. He became able to build houses and to do all kinds of labors, to perfect arts and sciences, but always because of the pressure of environment. It was the outside that was molding him. It was the outside that was transforming him. And it was to fulfill the outside that he dedicated all of his internal resources. Those resources which did not immediately profit him economically, or did not lead immediately to a security for his physical existence, these were simply ignored. But gradually, of course, man, developing further and further in his own unfoldment, became increasingly aware of new needs within himself. He found that it would be highly convenient to have certain extrasensory perceptions if he could develop them. He also began to realize that in the building of a great external, he had completely impoverished the internal, that his inner life was weak, and that he was depending for his existence upon an outer life that was not sufficiently secure to protect him or give him the growth that he needed. Therefore, in India and many other places, the problem of releasing internal became more and more important. And in the releasing of internal, it seemed to be that these internal pressures and processes could be symbolized in various ways. In Indian mythology, we have an elaborate symbolism of deities that are really only aspects of human consciousness. We had among the Greeks the same thing. They were fully aware that the legends and myths and stories of their Olympian gods were actually derived from pressures within themselves, that these deities were symbols of powers within man. In the museum in Baroda in India, I saw a magnificent example of religious ingenuity. A descent of a family, several generations of a family, worked upon a tremendous pattern, a cosmic kind of pattern of the universe and the human body. It was painted on fabric. If I remember, the painting was about 2 feet wide and 10 or 12 feet long. On this, every aspect of life was represented by appropriate deities. Every nerve end had a godling on it. Every muscle was part of a structure of a being in itself. And in this system, it was assumed that the cells, the various structures of the body, constituted a complete world of inhabited beings. That in this body of man, every type of creature known to our environment also existed symbolically and microscopically. That every cell had an integrity as much and as real as anything the composite being could produce. So if this were true, it then became obvious to the ancient that all these parts of the individual had their own laws, that they had certain rights and privileges, that there isn't a drop of blood in man that doesn't have rights, that hasn't responsibilities and opportunities. And the government of the composite human being has to be a righteous government to protect the rights and privileges and inalienable opportunities of these minute creatures. So to cover the body with all kinds of symbolic beings simply represented the efforts of the ancient to find out the dispositions and temperaments of the microorganisms that constitute together the human function. These were some of the animals. These are the sacred animals in antiquity. And each one of these is subject to abuses, subject to misdirections and misuse, subject to neglect, And all of this body, with all its minute parts, is under the dangerous government of self-centered, avaricious, ambitious human beings who are perfectly willing to sacrifice the lives within their bodies in order to advance their personal ambitions. So that man's body is actually under the rule of a ruthless dictatorship, like the heron who ate the frogs. The human body is made up of functions that have their own rights, just as levels of society, as nations, as races, as cultures, have their own prerogatives, their own inalienable privileges. Man, ignoring all of the rights of the inside of his own body, of the creatures that inhabit him and make his life possible, then falls into the most dangerous of all delusions and ends in sickness. The neglected parts rise in rebellion, and we have revolution and anarchy. Or these neglected parts simply die, setting up a decomposition that ultimately destroys the whole fabric. No one can break the rules, and the rules of life are almost all of them set forth in legends, myths, fables, and various symbolical representations. It was assumed that in this way the individual could achieve the understanding of them and could recognize their meaning, their true meaning. Now, in the Egyptian mysteries and in some of the other legend countries also, such as Tibet, Bhutan, and Nepal, the religious rites of the countries include masks, and these masks are mostly animal masks. And under the control of the temples where these designs originated and are maintained, these masks are worn by the actors when they perform certain cosmic dramas. Now, in Tibet, for instance, the animal masks are used very heavily to indoctrinate the people with the principles of Buddhism. It's interesting to note that in Tibet there is no fictional literature. There are no stories in Tibet. There are none of the horse operas and so forth that we have in the West. No penny dreadfuls and no dime novels. To the Tibetan, it's all very simple. If it isn't true, it isn't worth reading. And instead of fiction, they have what they might term a kind of true fictional interpretation of values and lives. They use true incidents and facts dramatically. They dramatize the common processes of living. And they also use their so-called literature, of which there is very little secular literature, to explain and expound the various doctrines and philosophies of their faiths. This is, in a sense, the same thing that you have in the fable. The Egyptian deities with their animal and bird masks conceal beneath their appearances meanings. And there is a suggestion that it is possible that the fables of Aesop were strongly influenced by the ritual mysteries of the rites of Isis and Osiris in Egypt. We find the same mysteries still practiced among the Indians of our southwest, where the Kachina masks include many animal forms, and these animal forms are humanized in ritual to represent the contributions of various forms of life in nature, and to remind us forever that there is nothing in nature that is actually ignorant. What we call ignorance is something that's peculiar to the human being, because other kingdoms have built-in intelligence which they cannot go against. This built-in intelligence is we call instinct, and instincts gradually evolve until they become intuitions. Instincts are the beginnings of knowledge, and they arise from our own innate integrities, these built-in truths that nothing can actually destroy. We interpret these truths as instincts to begin with, and these instincts become morally involved in the concept of conscience, but always behind a decision that is not artificially distorted. There is a natural integrity, and if the individual can follow the instinct that he has without allowing it to be distorted by some emotional or mental factor, he will find that his instincts lead him always in the way of truth. They lead him toward the explanation and solution of the mystery of himself. In the Aesop fables, we have some fables in which apparently all does not go well with the instinct patterns. We find some in which apparently scheming and strategy have a very large part to play. But even in these, the various creatures involved show a distinct tendency to build up a concept, a general understanding. First of all, we have, we might call, the ravenous factor, the wolf. The wolf is always a danger. And the old legends of the wolf we find in Aesop come back to us again in Little Red Riding Hood, which is almost certainly a story derived from India. In this we have the wolf disguising itself to represent the grandmother. Actually, the wolf in the Fables of Aesop always represents a natural or basic destructive tendency. The wolf is a savage, and it fulfills its own savagery, and the struggle of the human being against savagery is represented by its ability to outwit the wolf. Now, the wolf in ourselves is also something to take into consideration. The wolf in ourselves is usually a wolfishness in which, regardless of what happens, we want to have our own way. The wolf is therefore a factor in man which causes human beings to prey upon each other, on the understanding or on the concept that this is natural, normal, and proper. And in the fables, the wolf is always the villain, and its villainy is always so clearly received and so clearly understood that even small children, hearing the fables, realize that the wolf stands for something that is not true. Wolf is brute force. It is the strength of the forest. It is the power to pursue and destroy life. The next factor, or group of factors in the story, are the foxes. Now, the foxes are not as bad as the wolves. The foxes are more cunning. The fox is very protective. It wants to take care of itself. It wants to have its own way, but it is not going to get a face-on collision with a wolf. The fox, therefore, instead of representing brute force, he represents cunning, the ability to plot and to plan to get its own way with little or no dangerous consequences. Now, there are many people who live as foxes. They live off of their wits. They live off of their power to exploit others and consider it perfectly reasonable and perfectly proper to cheat for the sake of having what they want. The fox, therefore, is also cunning. It is able to use its faculties to achieve a variety of ends. Now, in the Fables of Aesop, the fox is not always evil. Sometimes it is a frustrated animal that tries to find ways to fulfill the needs of its own survival. But in substance, the fox represents not the open danger, but a more or less subtle danger arising from misrepresentation or falsification of values. In the same thing, in the same situation, we have the frogs. Now, the frogs, apparently, that concept in Aesop originated from the Dionysian and Eleusinian mysteries, and we remember the play, The Frogs, by Aristophanes, in which a chorus of frogs accompanies the candidate as he goes through the rituals of the rites and of the Eleusinian mysteries. Now, the frogs in the story are nearly always a noisy lot. They are heard from all the time. Also, in one of the fables of Aesop, a frog is so determined to be bigger than it is that it keeps puffing itself up in order to get larger and larger and larger, and the more it puffs and blows, the more difficulty it has in breathing and all that type of thing, but it is going to be bigger than anything else, no matter what it costs. So, in the due course of time, it goes on getting bigger and bigger until finally it bursts. Now, the frog in this case certainly represents a certain type of human being. And in the fable of Aesop, it represents the individual who tries to be what he is not, tries to be bigger than himself. He wants to be powerful, he wants to be rich, he wants to do all the things that larger and better equipped creatures indulge in, and he tries and tries and tries and ultimately destroys himself. So that the fable is, be moderate, do what you can, but never compete with that which is beyond you. Do not compete with something over which you have no control, or try to be bigger than you are. There is a very good old phrase about that that comes from the deep South, where there's a statement that says, there's no use trying to be what you ain't, because no matter what you try to be, you are what you is. And this is more or less the burden of the story of the frog. It is to be quiet and proper in relationships and not attempt to overdo any of the propensities of life. The frogs, therefore, are in a pond. They do not amount to too much, and their various sounds and noises can be called vox populi, the voice of the people. They're there, and they're living their own little lives in ponds. Now, these ponds can be nations. It doesn't make any difference how big the pond is. Remember always in the fable that the chief frog, the one that is the ruler of the pond, considers itself to be the most important thing in the whole world, even though the pond is only 10 feet across. So you can get great satisfaction from a small empire. And some people would much prefer to be a big frog in a small puddle than to be a small frog in a big puddle, because everything likes to have some form of authority or power. And this depends largely upon the environment. The larger the environment, the more is demanded of those who wish to excel or assume proportions of leadership. But there are very few people who do not want to lead in something. So the frogs are always present and are important to the legends and myths. Now, the birds also are very interesting. Probably the most important bird in the Aesop Fables group is the heron. This is a bird that looks like a stork. It has long legs and a long beak, and it has all kinds of requirements, and it lives very largely by living from creatures that have no actual form of defense. So that the heron, with its own peculiar equipment, very often gets into conflict with foxes and other creatures that are differently integrated. And there's one of the fables, of course, about the fox and the heron, in which the fox invites the heron to dinner, and when the heron arrives, all of the food is served in shallow, flat bowls, and the heron can't get its beak into it and get any, so it has no dinner. Then the heron says, it's my turn to return this compliment. You have invited me to dinner, so I will now invite you to dinner. And when the fox comes to dinner at the heron's house, everything is in tall, thin vases that the heron's beak can get, and the fox goes hungry. Now, there's a social significance in this point also. And in our human relationships, this type of situation, a sort of a vengeance over the dinner table, is not unknown. We also have a tendency to arrange our affairs so that our own peculiar tastes are the ones that are most likely to be gratified. In conversation, we like to talk about the subjects we are interested in. In business, we want to be in the business that we are most proficiently adapted for. So each individual sets up a world of its own, and in that world, everything is adjusted to the particular temperament of that individual. Now, we understand this all right, and we don't have any great offense against it, but it is very wise to realize that in following this pattern, we place unreasonable limitations upon ourselves. We lock ourselves more and more in a world in which we can feed, but from which we exclude all others. And when we go out to feast with someone else and they serve us their meal, we are apt to disagree with them because their meal may consist of their political allegiances, their religious allegiances, their hobbies, their beliefs, their doctrines, and their families, and all of the personal things of life, and the visitor is unable to gain any nutrition from the meeting. So the more specialized the individual becomes, the less he is able to adjust to the thoughts and attitudes of others. It is much better if we take the various foods and ideas which we have and put them in vessels of such shapes that all others can more or less feed with us out of the same bowls. This is very true in philosophy, for example, where it is very important to have beliefs and doctrines that you can share with people. If the beliefs and doctrines are too different, then one of the possible contributing parties is left out. So it is always wise to serve food in a jar or a vessel which is so shaped that all can gain proper nutrition. And this means that in philosophy or in religion, that the doctrines are such that they can be shared by others, that there is nothing in our way of life that is so completely separate from others that we live in an isolation caused by the restriction of our own viewpoints. Many orthodoxies of one kind or another have this tendency. They demand allegiance, they demand agreement, they demand that you eat the same food and that you take it from the vessel that fits them the best, rather than the vessel which may be useful to you. This type of thinking was well known to the Greeks and to most ancient peoples. Now, we also have a legend or a fable about fish. Once upon a time, there was a fisherman who was also a musician, and he loved to play the bagpipe. So he would sit down by the edge of the shore, start playing a dance tune on his bagpipe, and demand that the fishes should dance. They beautifully and completely ignored him, paying absolutely no attention and minding their own business as all well-behaved fish ought to do. Finally, exasperated with this situation, he put aside his musical instrument, got a net, and caught a lot of fish. And as soon as he used the net, they were caught. And while they were in the net along the edge of the shore, he started to play his music again, and now all the fishes danced. And the moral of the story was very simple. When you're in a predicament, such as the fish were in after they were caught, you do what you're told. You agree with your adversary quickly. So the fish danced when they had to, but they had no heart for it, actually. Now, we do this with people. We have various rules and so forth which people obey, but they have no real heart for them. We have to capture them first, hold them down, and force our will upon them. And there's nothing that human beings like to do better than to capture each other. They like to gain a control so that they can force other people to do what they're told to do. This is very largely true in governments, and very fantastically true in families, where some member of a family wants to play the music and all the others must dance. And the only way to get them to dance, perhaps, is to include them in your will. And after you've left them a large sum of money, it is a moral responsibility to dance for you. And in that way, they capture you and gain a control over your life, which is not fair, but very common. Also, they have a very good story in the Aesop's Fables about the dog that insisted on sleeping in the ox's manger. The ox had a nice stall and a box with his food in it. And this dog sat on the food and just barked. It didn't want the food, couldn't eat it, didn't want it, had no interest in it. But it just wanted to stay there because the ox wanted the food. It was a case of taking a certain joy in preventing somebody else from enjoying themselves, and also to make life difficult and obnoxious by bad disposition. So the fable very definitely points out that there are certain persons with temperaments that have no interest in certain things, but they are determined that others shall not have them or enjoy them. So they remain as dogs in the manger. They do not want it themselves, but they are determined that no one else will have it. This situation has led to a well-known adage, of course, that we all refer to quite frequently when we meet with difficult or objectionable people. Now, dogs also have a part to play in the fable world, because from very early times dogs have been very close to human beings and have served them in many capacities. Many of the fables, involving dogs, are quite humanized and quite adorable and pleasant in many, many cases. We find also that the horse and the jackass play important parts in fables, because they are domesticated animals with which we have contact. Also, the farmyard has its legends and its fables. Once upon a time there was a rooster, and it was a very handsome and very regal rooster that really ruled its roost without any doubt. And it was pecking away and cutting and scratching in the barnyard when it came upon a pearl. And the rooster looked at the pearl for a moment. Didn't mean very much to the rooster. So he looked at it, turned away, kept on scratching until he found some grain, and the grain made him very happy, but the pearl did nothing for him. And the moral of the very brief little statement is that you don't enjoy anything that you don't understand. Everything that is meaningless to you maybe has great meaning to someone else, but that only is worthwhile which you understand and for which you have immediate use. And if you are, for example, like the rooster in the barnyard, if you have a great deal of interest in your family, your home, your business, and you're going along day by day, fulfilling these normal responsibilities, you are not interested in abstract culture. You can live your whole life without ever studying art or music or anything of that kind, because it isn't part of your world. So the rooster and the pearl tells us that what isn't part of your world is of no interest to you. And yet sometimes the things that are of no interest are the most valuable of all. But they're only valuable to those who understand them and want them or need them. So in the story of the rooster and the pearl, you have the story of human appreciation. Why it is that some people can have the great aesthetic delight over some beautiful object which is meaningless to someone else. and also perhaps has something to do with our modern trends today, in which, in arts particularly, and in music, and in all these things, we have extreme mediocrity. Why? Because there is little basic interest in beauty. If beauty was valued, the rooster would have picked up the pearl. If beauty was valuable to us, we would not permit deformity to be recognized and glorified. But because we're not much interested, we leave it to as it is and go pecking for some food or seeds that we do understand. But the motto, of course, of the basic thought underlying it all is that what we do not appreciate is worthless. And each individual has to judge his appreciation for himself. He cannot derive it from other people. And so as we go through these different fables and legends, we find a great deal of very homely wisdom. We found a great many thoughts that we can interpret in terms of the present day. And if you've never read a version of Aesop's Fables, it might well do you to take a look and see how you could interpret the symbolism, how you can say what those fables mean to you, and how in one way or another they challenge you or ask something of you. They want you to do something a little differently, maybe a little better. They want you also to recognize the rewards of good actions and bad actions, and to recognize the importance of integrities under the pressure of stress and temptation. All these fables together are very interesting and delightful, and if the truth were known, they were probably gathered from practically every cultural system in the world, and they were projected through every generation for the last 3,000 years, or very nearly that long. Therefore, they give us a cross-section of what we have really thought, what we have really believed, and what we think we know, and how long we have held these thoughts. One thing that may help us a little from these fables is that the people of long ago were very much like ourselves. They had the same problems. They faced them in various ways as we do, but the fables would indicate that even in those days there was a great determination to do it better. There was a great requirement to grow and to overcome the weaknesses of human nature. There was violent outburst against dishonesty. There was a strong sense of morality. These things have not changed. They have gone on from generation to generation. And what we call the old world is nothing but the same as the new world, but it has been there a longer time. There is no real essential difference in the integrities of life. If we keep them, they keep us. If we break them, they break us. And this pattern of integrities is probably best presented to our direct attention through fables, legends, myths, and all these strange fragments that have come down to us, derived from the thoughtfulness of long ago. If, therefore, we find these interesting and intriguing, it certainly will be well worth our while to pick up an edition of Aesop. It's in print and always has been, and see what these mean in terms of thoughtful understanding in your own life of the principles that underlie fables, and how these fables can help you to correct situations that need attention in your daily activities. It's an interesting and I think a stimulating thought. Well, I guess that's all we can do this morning, but I'd like to make an announcement, and that is that next Sunday morning, of course, as you know, Dr. Irwin has passed on, and Mr. McIntosh, who was a very close friend of John and was interested in all the areas of Dr. Irwin's selection for next Sunday's lecture, is going to take it and carry it on as John himself would probably have handled it. So we thank that Mr. McIntosh, who is also a trustee of the Society. Also this afternoon, or at 1 o'clock, or very shortly thereafter, we're going to have a little memorial service here for John Irwin, and we are inviting all of you who would like to attend to be with us, and there will be an interesting factor in this. Andre Bello, who was John Irwin's protege in music, and has done great things in the advancement of his knowledge of the violin, and is really John's godson, is going to play at this memorial this afternoon, and you're all invited to attend. Many of you have heard Mr. Balog playing and know that he is really an extraordinary musician, a young man who already has a worldwide reputation. We hope you'll all attend this little service beginning at approximately 1 o'clock. We thank you for being with us this morning, and hope also that you will be able to hear our good friend next Sunday morning. Thank you very much.
We have a very interesting subject this morning, and one that probably is not often discussed these days, and that is the story of Aesop the slave. Very little is known about him historically. A few references in Herodotus. For the most part, he is an apocryphal figure. He's a mysterious, uncertain, dimly perceived personality who probably lived about 550 B.C. The meager descriptions that we have tell us that he was a slave, that he was deformed, he was a hunchback, and he was born dumb without the power of speech. But through the intercession of a goddess, probably Athena, his speech was given to him, and he went about telling fables, telling short, moralistic stories, pointing out because the fables point these things out, and they are of a kind and nature that helps us perhaps to understand the great span of human effort for the last 3,000 years. The origin of these fables is uncertain. A few probably can be attributed directly to Aesop, who gained a reputation for them. But the collections that have since been formed under his name did not all originate with him. There probably are not more than 50 of the fables that can definitely be traced to Aesop. Of the rest, more than 500 belong to various collections and classifications, interpretations and interpolations that assembled themselves later. One of the most interesting aspects of the fable is to try to find out in what part of the world it began. About the same time that Aesop was telling his stories and pointing out his little moral lessons to the Grecians, Gautama Buddha was using precisely the same methodology in his so-called Jataka tales. These Jatakas are really stories, presumably, of the previous incarnations of Buddha, and they go all the way back to his embodiment in various animal forms and the experiences that happened to him in the integrities and lack of integrities of his contemporaries. Because of his unusual wittiness and brilliance, he was freed by his master, but because of the sharp bobs in his stories and the rather
sadistic attitude he took towards the dominant policies of his time, he was finally framed on a charge of robbery and executed. This is all that we actually know about him. Now, the fable, as it stands by itself, apart from him, is usually a very short story with a very definite moral purpose. Fables are of many kinds. They are symbols, they are emblems, they are various devices of words to reveal unusual or significant meanings. From the collections of ancient fables that we have, it would appear that they taught essentially the same moral and ethical principles that we hold today. In other words, the ancient fable is a definite link in the descent of the integrities which we cherish now. But the fables point out that 2,500 years ago, they had the same integrities and also abused them. The same corruptions must have been present in these forms. There are the same moralisms, the same basic statements of integrities, and they were compiled at approximately the same time. We have not much understanding of contact between Asia and the Greek states at the time of Buddha. We know that the travelers from eastern countries, merchants particularly, did carry various goods along the caravan routes and were finally able to dispense with these goods at Ephesus, Antioch, and Alexandria. Therefore, there is no doubt that a certain amount of literature, a certain amount of legend and story followed the caravan routes and became accessible to the European and Near Eastern people. In any event, the two patterns are almost identical, and some of the actual fables are on exactly the same themes. So that somewhere in the past there was a contact between the East and West on the level of moral stories. Now, the fable is a very brief story, nearly always, seldom exceeding 100 or 200 words, sometimes not more than 50 words. But it tells a happening. It sets up a story of some kind. Now, the problem of the fables of Aesop have been somewhat complicated by the fact that most of his fables involve animals. The various fables that we have from him, and many others, including the recension of his fables by Fontaine later, these all humanize the intellects of other creatures that are not human. They make these creatures think as we do. They place them in situations that are uniquely human, and they bestow upon the animal the same essential integrities and vitalities that we associate with human beings. This has in turn led to considerable expansion of language and to the development of many ideas and concepts that have come down to us in nursery rhymes and Mother Goose stories, such as, for instance, the dog in the manger, and others of a similar nature. These fables began to appear in print almost immediately after the discovery of printing in Europe in 1450. And from that time on to the present day, every change, every development, every curiosity of printing can be traced directly from editions of Aesop's fables. All the famous printers made copies or published issues of these fables. And from the earliest printings, which were in the 1480s, to the present time, there's probably never been a year in which some version of Aesop's fables has not been in print. We are